In September 1992, the world witnessed one of the most dramatic financial events in modern history. A single currency collapsed. A government surrendered to the market. And one investor walked away with profits exceeding $1 billion in less than 24 hours. The event became known as Black Wednesday, and at the center of the story stood one man, George Soros, but this was not a story of luck or chaos. It was a story of economic pressure, political pride, and a financial system pushed beyond its limits. To understand how the British pound fell, we must first understand the system it was trapped inside. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Europe was moving toward economic unity. One of the biggest steps in that direction was the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, often called the ERM. The ERM was designed to keep European currencies stable by locking them into fixed exchange rate bands against the German Deutsche Mark. In simple terms, countries agreed that their currencies would not rise or fall beyond a narrow range. If pressure pushed a currency too low, the country's central bank would intervene by buying its own currency or raising interest rates. In 1990, the United Kingdom joined the ERM. At the time, the decision was deeply political. Britain wanted to appear strong, disciplined, and fully European. But economically, the timing could not have been worse. The British economy was slowing down. Inflation was high. Unemployment was rising. Housing prices were falling. Yet to stay inside the ERM, Britain was forced to keep interest rates painfully high, around 10 to 15%, choking businesses and households alike. Meanwhile, Germany was facing a very different reality. After reunification in 1990, Germany raised interest rates to control inflation in the former East Germany. Because the ERM revolved around the Deutsche Mark, other countries, including Britain, were forced to follow Germany's monetary policy, even though it damaged their own economies. This imbalance created a fundamental problem: the British pound was overvalued, and in financial markets, overvalued currencies do not stay overvalued forever. By 1992, global investors were watching closely. Among them was George Soros, manager of the Quantum Fund, one of the most powerful hedge funds in the world. Soros believed in something called reflexivity, the idea that markets are driven not just by fundamentals, but by perceptions, expectations, and feedback loops. If enough people believe a currency is unsustainable, their actions can make that belief come true. Soros and his team began to analyze Britain's position inside the ERM. The conclusion was clear: the British government could not maintain the pound's fixed exchange rate without causing severe economic damage at home. Either Britain would have to raise interest rates even higher, risking recession, or it would eventually be forced to devalue the pound or exit the ERM entirely. Soros decided to bet against the pound. This was done through a strategy known as short selling. The Quantum Fund borrowed billions of pounds and immediately sold them for stronger currencies like the Deutsche Mark. If the pound fell, Soros could buy it back at a lower price, return the borrowed pounds, and keep the difference as profit. But this strategy only worked if the British government failed to defend its currency, and at first, the government fought back. On the morning of September 16, 1992, Black Wednesday, massive selling pressure hit the pound. Traders around the world were dumping it at an unprecedented scale. The Bank of England responded by intervening directly in the markets, spending billions of pounds from its foreign currency reserves to buy back the pound and support its value. At the same time, the British government made a dramatic announcement: interest rates would rise from 10% to 12%. Immediately, the message was clear: Britain would not give up, but the markets were not convinced. Instead of restoring confidence, the rate hikes signaled desperation. Traders saw government trapped by its own promises. Selling intensified. By midday, the situation worsened. The Bank of England was burning through reserves at a terrifying speed. Billions were spent, yet the pound continued to fall. Then came the second shock. The government announced that interest rates would rise again, this time to 15%. It was an extraordinary move. For homeowners, businesses, and borrowers across Britain, it was a nightmare. But even this extreme measure failed to stop the market, because the underlying problem had not changed. Britain's economy could not survive such rates. And traders knew as confidence collapsed, the government faced a brutal reality. It could no longer defend the pound. By the evening of September 16, Britain officially withdrew from the ERM. The pound was allowed to float freely, and almost instantly, it fell. For George Soros, the bet paid off. By the end of the day, his fund had made an estimated $1 billion in profit, earning him the title that would follow him forever, the man who broke the Bank of England. But this was not just Soros' victory. It was a lesson in how markets can overpower governments. A lesson in how political decisions can collide with economic reality, in a moment that reshaped Britain's financial future for decades to come. When Britain withdrew from the exchange rate mechanism on the night of September 16, 1992, the immediate reaction was panic. Politicians spoke of humiliation. Newspapers declared disaster. And financial commentators warned that Britain's global credibility had been shattered. For Prime Minister John Major, Black Wednesday was a personal and political catastrophe. His government had promised stability. Instead, it delivered the most dramatic currency collapse in modern British history, yet something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. The British economy did not collapse. It began to recover. Almost immediately after leaving the ERM, the pound fell sharply, by nearly 15% against the Deutsche Mark and the US dollar. At first glance, this looked like confirmation of failure. But beneath the surface, the devaluation triggered a powerful economic shift. British exports suddenly became cheaper and more competitive. Manufacturing firms that had struggled for years found new demand overseas. Tourism increased as Britain became more affordable to foreign visitors. For the first time in years, businesses felt relief instead of pressure. Interest rates, no longer tied to defending an artificial exchange rate, were cut aggressively. Within months, rates fell from emergency levels to more manageable territory. Mortgage payments dropped. Consumer spending slowly returned. The suffocating grip on the economy loosened. Ironically, the very freedom Britain lost face to gain became the foundation of its recovery. By 1993, economic growth resumed. By 1994, inflation was under control. By the mid-1990s, Britain was experiencing one of the longest uninterrupted periods of growth in its modern history. Many economists would later argue that leaving the ERM saved the British economy, but at the time, the political damage was already done. The Conservative Party never fully recovered from Black Wednesday. Trust in economic competence evaporated. In 1997, Labour swept into power in a landslide victory, ending 18 years of Conservative rule. Black Wednesday had become a symbol, not just of financial defeat, but of political misjudgment, and looming over the entire episode was one name: George Soros. In the aftermath, headlines across the world labeled him the man who broke the Bank of England. His estimated $1 billion profit became legendary. To some, Soros was a financial genius who exposed a broken system. To others, he was a ruthless speculator who profited from national suffering. Soros rejected the idea that he attacked Britain. He argued that markets simply revealed truths governments refused to face. The pound, he said, was fundamentally mispriced. Britain's ERM membership was economically unsustainable. His trade merely accelerated the inevitable, and history largely supports that view. The British government had entered the ERM at an unrealistic exchange rate. Political pride overruled economic logic. When reality collided with policy, the market won, but the legacy of Black Wednesday extended far beyond Britain. Across Europe, policymakers began to reassess fixed exchange rate systems. The event exposed the danger of forcing different economies to follow a single monetary path without political union. Ironically, the lesson of Black Wednesday would later influence the design of the euro, a currency with no national escape valve. Some critics argue that the eurozone crisis decades later echoed the same structural flaws Britain faced in 1992. For Soros himself, Black Wednesday transformed him into a global figure. He was no longer just a hedge fund manager. He became a symbol of market power, and a lightning rod for controversy. In the years that followed, Soros expanded his focus beyond finance. Through the Open Society Foundations, he invested billions into education, democracy promotion, and human rights across the world, yet his financial past never faded. To supporters, Soros proved that markets punish bad policy. To critics, he became a convenient villain, blamed for everything from currency collapses to political unrest, often without evidence. What Black Wednesday truly demonstrated was something deeper. Governments can delay reality, they can deny it, they can spend billions fighting it, but they cannot defeat it. the Bank of England lost billions defending an illusion. Britain lost political credibility. Yet in the long run, the country gained something more valuable, economic independence. Today, many British economists quietly acknowledge that September 16, 1992 was not just a failure, it was a turning point. A moment when economic truth overpowered political fiction. A reminder that markets are not moral or immoral, they are mechanical. They respond to incentives, imbalances, and pressure. George Soros did not create Britain's weakness, he recognized it, and when the moment came, he acted. More than 3 decades after Black Wednesday, the story is still told with emotion, suspicion, and controversy. For some, it is remembered as a humiliating national defeat. For others, it is framed as evidence of shadowy financiers manipulating nations for profit, and at the center of every version of the story stands one name, George Soros. But how much of what people believe about Black Wednesday is actually true, and how much is myth? One of the most common claims is that Soros single-handedly broke the British pound. The reality is far more complex. Currency markets are vast. Even in 1992, they involved trillions of dollars moving across borders. No individual, no matter how wealthy, could collapse a major currency without underlying weakness. Soros did not create the conditions that led to Black Wednesday. He identified them. Britain's problem was structural. The pound was locked into the exchange rate mechanism at a level it could not realistically sustain. Inflation was higher than Germany's. Economic growth was weaker. Interest rates were already punishing. Political leadership was divided. The market simply noticed what policymakers ignored. Another widespread myth is that Soros attacked Britain out of hostility or political motive. There is no credible evidence to support this. At the time, Soros was not an activist investor. He was a macro trader responding to economic signals. His position against the pound was not secret. Other hedge funds and banks took similar bets. Soros became the symbol because his position was the largest, and because it succeeded so visibly. In truth, Britain was already defending the pound against the entire market, not against one man. There is also a misconception that Black Wednesday permanently weakened Britain. The opposite is closer to the truth. Once freed from the ERM, Britain regained control over monetary policy. Interest rates were adjusted based on domestic needs rather than foreign constraints. Exports surged. Inflation stabilized. Growth returned. In hindsight, Black Wednesday marked the end of a policy mistake, not the beginning of decline. Even the Bank of England learned lasting lessons from the event. The crisis exposed the dangers of political interference in monetary policy. A few years later, the bank was granted operational independence, a reform widely regarded as one of the most important in modern British economic history. That change alone reshaped how Britain managed inflation, interest rates, and financial stability for decades. But myths persist because Black Wednesday feels uncomfortable. It challenges a comforting belief that governments are always in control. In reality, markets reflect collective judgment. They reward sustainable policy and punish denial. When the two collide, power shifts quickly and brutally. This is why Black Wednesday continues to be studied in universities, central banks, and trading floors around the world. It is not just a story about Britain, it is a warning. The same dynamics have appeared again and again, in Asia during the 1997 financial crisis, in Europe during the Eurozone debt crisis, and in emerging markets facing currency collapse. Fixed exchange rates without economic alignment create pressure, political pride delays correction, markets eventually force it. George Soros' legacy is inseparable from this lesson. To his admirers, he represents intellectual honesty, a willingness to challenge false assumptions and act decisively. To his critics, he embodies the unsettling reality that financial power can rival national power. Both views contain truth. Soros himself has repeatedly argued that markets are not moral agents. They do not choose outcomes based on fairness. They respond to incentives, fear, and opportunity. In that sense, Black Wednesday was not personal, it was mechanical. Britain promised something it could not deliver, the market tested that promise, and it failed, yet failure brought clarity. In the years after Black Wednesday, Britain avoided joining the euro. It maintained its own currency. It retained control over interest rates, a choice that later proved crucial during global financial shocks. Many economists now argue that Britain's ability to respond independently during later crises was rooted in lessons learned in 1992. What once looked like humiliation became insulation, and what once looked like defeat became adaptation. So did George Soros break the British pound in 24 hours? No, the pound was already broken by policy. Soros simply held up the mirror. Black Wednesday remains a reminder that economic reality cannot be suspended by political will. Exchange rates cannot be defended forever by speeches or reserves. And credibility, once lost, cannot be bought back with emergency announcements. In the end, this is not a story about one man defeating a nation. It is a story about truth overtaking illusion, and a reminder that in global finance, reality always wins. More than 30 years have passed since Black Wednesday, yet its shadow still stretches across the global financial system. The world has changed. Markets are faster. Capital moves instantly. Algorithms now execute trades in milliseconds. But the core lesson of 1992 remains unchanged. Economic reality cannot be negotiated. What happened to Britain was not unique, it was simply one of the clearest examples of a government colliding with the limits of monetary control. And since then, history has repeated the same pattern again and again. In the modern era, currencies no longer fall in silence, they collapse on live television, they trend on social media, and they spark political crises overnight. From emerging markets to advanced economies, governments still attempt to defend exchange rates, control capital flows, and project confidence, even when fundamentals are broken. And markets still respond the same way they did in 1992. Relentlessly. One of the biggest misconceptions about Black Wednesday is that it belonged to a different time, an era before globalization fully matured. In reality, the forces Soros exploited are stronger today than ever before. Capital is more mobile, information is more transparent, and confidence can evaporate in minutes. In 1992, traders relied on phones and terminals. Today, artificial intelligence monitors macroeconomic imbalances continuously. When weakness appears, it is detected instantly, and priced in mercilessly. This is why modern central banks study Black Wednesday so closely. It explains what happens when credibility cracks. In recent decades, similar dynamics have unfolded across the world. Countries have defended pegs, burned reserves, raised interest rates, made emergency announcements, and ultimately surrendered. The pattern is always the same: political denial first, market pressure second, capitulation last. What made Britain's case unique was not the collapse, but the recovery. Unlike many nations that experienced currency crises, Britain had strong institutions, flexible markets, and the ability to adapt quickly. Once the ERM constraint was removed, policy aligned with reality. That alignment is the real lesson. Countries that accept adjustment recover, countries that resist it prolong pain. This is where George Soros' role becomes widely misunderstood. Soros did not invent currency speculation, he did not destabilize functioning economies, he operated where policy and reality diverged. And when that divergence grows large enough, speculation is no longer destructive, it becomes corrective. This is an uncomfortable truth for governments, because it means failure is often internal before it becomes external. Today, policymakers still struggle with this idea. They speak of market attacks and external pressure, when the real vulnerability lies in misaligned policy, excessive debt, or unrealistic promises. Black Wednesday stripped away the illusion that sovereignty alone guarantees control. Control must be earned through credibility. One of the most lasting impacts of 1992 was how it reshaped central banking philosophy. Independence, transparency, and inflation targeting became the norm, not because they were fashionable, but because the alternative had failed publicly. The Bank of England's independence was not symbolic, it was defensive. A firewall against political pressure. A recognition that markets trust rules more than rhetoric. Globally, this shift defined the next generation of monetary policy. But the story does not end there. In the 21st century, governments found new tools: quantitative easing, capital controls, currency interventions at unprecedented scale. These tools delayed consequences, but did not eliminate them. Even today, nations face the same dilemma Britain faced in 1992: defend credibility at the cost of growth, or accept adjustment and regain control. There is no painless option. That is why Black Wednesday remains relevant, not as history, but as warning, and not because of George Soros, but because of human behavior. Markets are collections of decisions: fear, confidence, trust, doubt. When trust breaks, no reserve is large enough. No interest rate high enough. No speech convincing enough. In hindsight, Britain's mistake was not leaving the ERM, it was staying too long. That delay multiplied losses, and that pattern continues worldwide. The most dangerous moment in any financial system is not collapse, it is denial. By the time collapse becomes visible, the damage is already done. Black Wednesday teaches us that adjustment feels like failure in the short term, but denial guarantees failure in the long term. For Britain, accepting reality restored stability. For George Soros, the episode cemented his place in financial history. But for the world, the true legacy was clarity. Markets do not care who you are, they do not care what you promise, they only care whether you can deliver, and when you cannot, they move on. That is why Black Wednesday is still taught, still debated, still misunderstood, and still relevant, because somewhere, at this very moment, another government is defending another illusion, and somewhere else, the market is watching, waiting. Black Wednesday may feel like history, but the forces it exposed are not fading, they are evolving. In today's financial system, currency power no longer belongs solely to governments. It is shared with markets, institutions, algorithms, and increasingly, technology itself. What happened in 1992 was a warning shot. What followed was transformation. In the decades after Britain exited the ERM, global finance entered a new era. Capital controls weakened. Financial instruments became more complex. Hedge funds grew larger, faster, and more influential. And information began to travel at unprecedented speed. The world that allowed George Soros to profit from a mispriced currency is now far more interconnected, and far less forgiving. In 1992, a currency crisis unfolded over weeks and days. Today, it can unfold in hours, sometimes minutes. Modern hedge funds no longer rely solely on human judgment. They combine macroeconomic theory with machine learning, real-time data, satellite imagery, and sentiment analysis. Weakness is identified earlier. Reactions are faster. And mistakes are punished instantly. This has changed the balance of power. Governments still issue currencies, but they no longer control the narrative around them. Credibility is now crowdsourced, built or destroyed by millions of decisions across global markets. Central banks understand this. That is why communication has become as important as policy. A single sentence from a central banker can move trillions of dollars. A poorly worded announcement can undo years of trust. This reality traces directly back to Black Wednesday. It taught policymakers that defending an illusion is more dangerous than accepting adjustment. Yet despite that lesson, history keeps repeating itself. Fixed pegs still fail, overvalued currencies still crack, political denial still delays necessary reform, and markets still apply pressure without mercy. What has changed is the environment in which this happens. The rise of digital assets has introduced a new dimension to currency power. Cryptocurrencies were born from distrust in centralized systems. Their supporters argue that money should exist outside government control, immune to political manipulation and inflationary policy. Critics argue the opposite, that unregulated currencies invite instability and speculation. But regardless of ideology, one thing is clear: confidence is still everything. Just like the pound in 1992, digital currencies rise and fall on belief. When trust fades, value evaporates. When belief returns, prices recover. The mechanism is the same, only the technology has changed. Some central banks have responded by developing central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, state-backed digital money designed to preserve control while modernizing infrastructure. This represents the next battlefield. The same tension remains: flexibility versus control. Credibility versus convenience, reality versus promise. Black Wednesday offers a framework for understanding this future. It shows that no system, physical or digital, can survive prolonged misalignment between policy and reality. If digital currencies promise stability but deliver volatility, trust will disappear. If governments promise discipline but practice denial, markets will respond. The tools are new, the rules are not. Even today, policymakers debate how much power markets should have. Some argue that speculation destabilizes economies. Others argue that speculation exposes weakness early. before it becomes catastrophic. Black Wednesday supports the second argument. The pound did not collapse because it was attacked, it collapsed because it was mispriced. The attack simply revealed it. This distinction matters, especially in an age where blame is often externalized. When currencies fail, it is tempting to point to traders, hedge funds, or foreign actors, but markets do not create imbalance, they detect it, and when detection turns into consensus, correction becomes unavoidable. The future of global finance will not be decided by eliminating speculation, it will be decided by managing reality. Countries that adapt quickly will recover. Countries that resist will repeat history. This is why Black Wednesday remains relevant to policymakers, investors, and ordinary citizens alike. It is not about Britain. It is not about Soros. It is about systems under stress, and how humans respond when confidence breaks. In the end, the greatest lesson of 1992 is not financial, it is psychological. People believe until they don't, and when belief ends, systems change. Britain learned that lesson the hard way, and emerged stronger. Others were not so fortunate. As the world moves deeper into a digital, fast-moving, interconnected financial future, the question is no longer whether another Black Wednesday will happen, it is where, and who will recognize it first, because somewhere, right now, a currency is being defended. A promise is being repeated, and a market is quietly asking the same question it asked in 1992, is this sustainable? Black Wednesday is often remembered through numbers: billions lost, interest rates raised, currencies devalued, profits made. But behind every chart and headline was something far less abstract: people, homeowners watching mortgage payments spike overnight. Small businesses struggling to survive sudden rate hikes. Workers facing uncertainty as companies froze hiring or shut down entirely. For them, Black Wednesday was not a lesson in macroeconomics, it was a moment of personal fear. This is the side of financial crises that rarely makes it into textbooks, and yet, it is the most important. When governments make monetary decisions, they are not moving symbols on a screen. They are shaping the lives of millions, often without those people ever understanding why things changed so suddenly. In 1992, the British government raised interest rates not because it wanted to hurt citizens, but because it believed credibility demanded sacrifice. Staying in the exchange rate mechanism had become a symbol of strength. Leaving it felt like weakness. That belief was costly. The pressure fell not on policymakers, but on ordinary households, and this pattern repeats itself throughout history. Currency crises do not punish governments first, they punish citizens. This is why Black Wednesday still matters, not just as an economic case study, but as a moral one, because it raises an uncomfortable question: who should bear the cost of defending a policy that no longer works? In Britain's case, the answer eventually became clear. The cost was too high. The defense was unsustainable. Adjustment, though humiliating, was necessary, but not all countries reach that conclusion in time. Some cling to fixed exchange rates while reserves vanish. Others impose capital controls that trap savings. Some print money to delay pain, only to multiply it later. In each case, the logic is the same: postpone reality, no matter the cost. Markets do not see faces, they see numbers, but governments are supposed to see both. This is where responsibility enters the story. George Soros is often portrayed as the villain or hero of Black Wednesday. But focusing solely on him misses the deeper issue. Soros acted within the rules of the system. He did not force Britain into the ERM. He did not set interest rates. He did not make political promises. He observed a contradiction and responded. The real power, and therefore the real responsibility, lay with policymakers. This distinction matters because modern debates about finance often blur accountability. When currencies fall, blame is pushed outward, onto traders, speculators, or foreign forces, but markets do not write policy, governments do, and when policy ignores economic reality, markets become messengers, not enemies. This does not mean markets are benevolent. They are indifferent. They correct imbalances without regard for social cost. That is why governance matters. Strong institutions soften shocks, weak institutions magnify them. Britain's recovery after 1992 was not guaranteed. It happened because the country had resilient legal systems, flexible labor markets, and the political capacity to change course. Many countries do not. that is why similar crises elsewhere led to prolonged recessions, social unrest, and lost decades of growth. The lesson is not that speculation is good, the lesson is that denial is worse. For ordinary people, the real tragedy of Black Wednesday was not the devaluation itself, it was the delay. The longer Britain defended an unrealistic exchange rate, the more painful the adjustment became. This is a universal truth in economics: early correction is cheaper than late collapse, yet politically, early correction is harder. It requires admitting mistakes. It requires abandoning symbols. It requires leadership willing to trade pride for stability. Black Wednesday exposed how rare that leadership can be. Today, as nations face rising debt, aging populations, climate costs, and technological disruption, monetary decisions will only grow more complex. The temptation to hide problems behind fixed rates, subsidies, or short-term stimulus will remain strong, and markets will continue to test those choices, not out of malice, out of mechanics. In the end, the most important legacy of Black Wednesday is not about currency trading or hedge funds. It is about humility, the humility to accept limits, the humility to adjust when reality changes, the humility to place long-term stability above short-term image. Britain learned this lesson in 1992. Painfully, publicly, but effectively. That is why, decades later, Black Wednesday is not remembered only as a failure, but as a turning point. A moment when illusion collapsed, and truth took its place. Because in finance, as in life, systems do not fail when reality is harsh, they fail when reality is denied. After 7 chapters, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: Black Wednesday was not an accident, it was not a conspiracy, and it was not the work of a single individual. It was the predictable outcome of decisions made under pressure, sustained by denial, and exposed by reality. This is why the story still matters, not because it happened, but because it keeps happening, in different countries, under different names, with the same consequences. The final lesson of Black Wednesday is not about currency trading. It is about systems under stress, and how they respond when confidence begins to fracture. Every financial system rests on belief: belief that a currency will hold value, belief that a government can honor its promises, belief that tomorrow will resemble today. Once that belief weakens, no amount of force can restore it instantly. In 1992, Britain tried to substitute belief with defense. It spent reserves. It raised interest rates. It issued statements of resolve. But belief cannot be commanded, it must be earned. Markets sensed the gap between promise and reality, and they moved. For investors, Black Wednesday offers a lesson that goes beyond profit. The most powerful trades are not about prediction, they are about recognition. George Soros did not predict chaos. He recognized imbalance. He did not cause collapse. He identified fragility. That distinction is critical. Speculation does not create weakness, it reveals it. For governments, the lesson is harder and more uncomfortable. Economic credibility is not built through stubbornness. It is built through adaptability. The longer a flawed policy is defended, the greater the eventual cost of abandoning it. Black Wednesday teaches that early humility is cheaper than late pride. For ordinary people, the silent majority affected by decisions they never voted on, the lesson is awareness: currency stability is not guaranteed. Interest rates are not neutral. Policy choices made in distant rooms eventually arrive at kitchen tables. Understanding this does not remove risk, but it reduces surprise, and surprise is what turns financial stress into social trauma. Another lesson of Black Wednesday is about blame. When systems fail, societies search for villains. They personalize complexity. They look for names instead of causes. This instinct is human, but misleading. Blaming Soros is easier than confronting policy mistakes. Blaming markets is easier than admitting misjudgment, but real resilience comes from learning, not blaming. Britain recovered because it learned. It accepted adjustment. It changed its framework. It redefined credibility. That is why the pound survived. That is why the economy stabilized. That is why the crisis became a turning point rather than a terminal decline. This is the difference between collapse and correction. Correction hurts, but it heals. Collapse delays and destroys. Black Wednesday also reminds us that speed matters. In 1992, it took months for pressure to build and hours for collapse to unfold. Today, that timeline is compressed. Algorithms do not hesitate. Capital does not wait. Confidence disappears faster than ever before, which makes denial even more dangerous. In the modern financial world, transparency is not optional. Credibility is not permanent. And control is always conditional. The systems that survive are not the strongest, but the most flexible. This is the final paradox of Black Wednesday. Britain looked weak when it withdrew from the ERM, but that act of weakness became strength. By admitting failure, it regained control. By abandoning illusion, it restored trust, and by learning publicly, it avoided repeating the same mistake. That is why Black Wednesday still appears in textbooks, boardrooms, and policy debates, not as a story of defeat, but as a manual for survival, because the question it asks is timeless. What do you do when reality contradicts your promise? You can deny it, you can defend it, or you can adjust. History shows only one option works. In the end, Black Wednesday teaches us something larger than economics. It teaches that systems endure not because they are perfect, but because they are corrected, and that lesson, more than any profit or loss, is why this story will never disappear. Every great financial story eventually arrives at the same place: silence, after the headlines fade, after the markets close, after the blame is assigned and the arguments end. What remains is not the noise, but the truth. Black Wednesday was loud in 1992. Markets crashed. Politicians panicked. Commentators shouted. But with distance, the meaning of that day becomes clearer and quieter. It was never about a single trade, it was never about a single man, and it was never truly about the British pound. It was about illusion. Britain believed it could hold an exchange rate that its economy could not support. Political leadership believed confidence could be manufactured through commitment alone. And for a time, that belief held, until it didn't. Markets are often described as aggressive, ruthless, or predatory. But markets are not conscious actors. They do not wake up with intent. They do not feel loyalty or hostility. They respond to incentives, imbalances, and contradictions. On Black Wednesday, the contradiction was simple. Britain promised stability without the economic conditions to sustain it. The promise collided with reality, and reality prevailed. This is where George Soros enters history, not as a villain or hero, but as a participant in a much larger mechanism. His trade did not create weakness. It confirmed it. If Soros had never existed, the outcome would have been the same, perhaps slower, perhaps messier, but inevitable. That is the uncomfortable truth behind many financial crises. They are blamed on individuals, but caused by systems, and systems fail not because reality is harsh, but because it is ignored. Black Wednesday reminds us that credibility is not something declared, it is something tested. Every exchange rate, every interest rate, every economic promise exists on probation. The moment trust weakens, the test begins. For Britain, that test ended in withdrawal from the ERM. The decision looked like surrender. In reality, it was acceptance, and acceptance is where recovery begins. Once the illusion was abandoned, Britain regained control. Policy aligned with conditions. Pressure eased. Growth returned. What felt like defeat became recalibration. This pattern repeats far beyond finance. Organizations fail when they protect image over truth. Governments fail when they defend symbols over outcomes. Individuals fail when they deny limits instead of adapting. Black Wednesday is simply a financial expression of a universal rule. Reality always collects its debt, sometimes quietly, sometimes suddenly, but always fully. That is why this story has survived decades of retelling. Not because of drama, but because of relevance. Every generation rediscovers the same tension, between promise and capacity, confidence and denial. In a world moving faster than ever, this lesson matters more, not less. Today's markets are instant. Capital crosses borders in milliseconds. Confidence evaporates in real time. The space between illusion and exposure has narrowed. There is less room to pretend, which means humility has become a competitive advantage. The strongest systems today are not the most rigid, but the most responsive. They listen early. They adjust quickly. They treat warning signs as information, not threats. Black Wednesday punishes denial, but it rewards correction. That is the final irony of the story. Britain did not fall because it failed.